Tov. Today's daf yomi is Bava Kamma daf Kuf Yud Ches 118. We're going to start at the bottom of 117b, at least 10 lines from the bottom. And today's daf yomi is dedicated for Yeshua, for Am Yisrael, a Shmira for the Chayalim, Natzoa for the Shvuyim. Says the Mishnah, Shatva Nahar. Let's say there was a river that came along and after you stole property. Somebody, Rahman al stole somebody else's field. Then the river came along and ruined the field. You could say, Omer lo arishal chalafanecha. You could say, well, here's your field, I'm returning it to you, even though it's ruined. And the basic point is that you can't really steal real estate. But the Braisa argues with this. Rebbe Lezer says, no, you have to give him a new field. So, Chacham say, no, you could say to him, here's your field. So Chachamim are like our Mishnah. So what's the dispute between the Chachamim and Rabbi Eliezer? Rabbi Eliezer, the Gemara says the dispute is as follows. Rabbi Eliezer Darsh Ribuye Umiyute. Rabbi Eliezer expounds the amplifications and limitation. It says V'chichesh be'abiso. He denies his friend. That's a riboy. That's an amplification in the pasuk. Bipikadon. That refers to. And then when it says in the pasuk, "Bepikadon with a deposit," that's a miyat. That's a limitation. Kosher shaval of a sheker. Whatever is where it's falsely about chazav a riba comes back and amplifies riba. Umiyat v'riba. You have an amplification, limitation, amplification. Riba kol. You're including everything. My Rabbi. So what's it including? Including kol miyeh, everything is included in this obligation to return something that you stole. My miyet, what's it excluding? Shtaros, that if you stole a contract, then the laws of theft don't apply. Rabbanan darashe kol yu prate, meaning to say that according to Rebbe Lazar, they do apply to real estate. Whereas the Rabbanan expound kol yu prate, general followed by a specific. Ukichesh klal, that's a klal, that's a general. The pikadon is a prat. Oh, mikol chazav a klal. So then you have what's called a general followed by a specific followed by a general. Therefore, kol prat to klal yatada el keina prat. As the only things that are similar to the specific. Ma prat davar metalta v'gufa mamon. Just like the specific is something that could be moved, and in essence is intrinsically money. I've called davar metalta v'gufa mamon. So in order for these laws of theft to apply, it has to be something that's movable and also is intrinsically money. Yatsu karkos, this excludes real estate, she'em metalton, that are not movable. Yatsu avadim excludes slaves, shehukshul karkos, they're comparable to real estate. Yatsu shtaros, it excludes contracts, she'aval pisha metalton, even though they're movable, in gufa mamon. They're not intrinsically money, they just represent money. Tanya, so the Gemara says, is that really the dispute that Rebbe Lazar says? It's because real estate can't be stolen. And the Chum say it can. What about the following price? That goes on a para b'shat fanar. You steal a cow and the river ruins the cow. Chayav lamidu a para. You have to give him a new cow. Divrei Rebbe Lazar, Chum omer lo areshal chalafanecha. The Chum say no. You could just say here's your cow, even though it washed away, and that's not real estate. So we see that it must be a different reason because the Chum say they're positioned even by a cow. Mar says no. No, there. What are they arguing about? Amar Papa. Where you stole the friend, you stole the field, and there was a cow crouching on the field, and so therefore it's like real estate because it was bought by agav, by dint of the fact that you're buying the real estate. Along with that, by dint of the fact that you're taking the real estate, along with that you're getting the cow. And so that's how you acquired the cow. But according to the Chum, say you can't steal the real estate, then you wouldn't get the cow. So the Rebbe Lazar tamei, Rabbanan tamei. So since the cow is crouching, they're par of lutzabel v'shat fanar. So the Rebbe Lazar tamei, Rabbanan tamei. So basically, Rebbe Lazar says you got the cow because you got the real estate, whereas the Chacham say you didn't get the cow since you didn't get the real estate. Next case, says the Mishnah on top of Kufi Chesam and Aleph. Hagozo es chavero. Somebody who robs his friend, or he borrows money from him, or he deposits gives him a deposit. If he does all of these things, B'yishav, meaning to say in an urban area, well, Yachzer Lo Midbar, he can't return it to him outside of the urban area in the wilderness. But if he does it, Amanas, let's say it's Midbar, if he borrows or he accepts the deposit, or with the condition that he's going to go out to the wilderness, then Yachzer Lo Midbar. Then he can even return to him even in the wilderness. But we have a contradiction. Here we say you can't pay the loan back in the wilderness, but we have another source which says that a loan is paid back anywhere. Whereas in Avedo Pikadon, Emishtalman Album Komod. Whereas the deposit and the lost object can only be paid back in their place, can only be returned in their place. So that contradicts our Mishnah, because our Mishnah says the loan can only be paid back in the urban area. So Bava Kamma, Milva Nisno Itave B'Kol Makom. No, it's not the borrower that he can pay back any place. It means the person who's the lender who wants to make a claim for his money, he can make the claim for the money wherever he is. Whereas an Avedo Pikadon, on Nisno Utibai Album Koman, the lost object and deposit there, you can only make the claim for them in the place where they were. Manas taste midbar. But if you do it on the condition that you're going to go out into the wilderness, then it's going to be considered viable. Then we're going to say he can return to him in the wilderness. So Gemara says Pshita, that's obvious. Gemara says no, this is why it's needed for. He says to him, let my deposit be with you, the ana midbar nafikna, because I'm also because I'm going out into the wilderness. He says, let me leave my deposit with you and leave my Rolex with you, because I'm going out into the wilderness. And the other one says, he says, you know, it just so happens I'm also going to the wilderness. And then it says, basically, he didn't say explicitly I can return to there. He said, I'm going out into the wilderness also. So I guess if it makes sense, I'll return it to you. Means to say, his intent is to say, well, that I intended to say that I have the right to return to you there. That's the implication. That's what the Gemara is telling us. That's the chiddush of the Mishnah. If a person says to his friend, I stole money from you, Vitani, or I borrowed money from you, or if or you put your deposit with me, but for some reason I don't know if I returned it to you. Or if I didn't return it to you, then he needs to pay. Then he needs to pay the money. But if he says to him, but he says, I have no idea if I stole from you in the first place, or if I borrowed from you, or if you deposit with me, then he's exempt. So the Gemara says, Idmar, we learned, Manui biyatcha. We learned if a person says, you owe me $100, the other guy says, I have no idea if this is true. Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda, Amar Chaim, he says he has to pay it back. Rav Nachman, Rav Yochanan, Amri Pater. They say he's exempt. Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda, Amri Chaim, because this is our old friend. Now we've seen in Kedushin and all over Shas that if you say Bari Vishema, one person is certain and the other one is uncertain, Bari Adin, then the certain one position prevails. Here he says, you owe me the money. And the other one says, and this one says, you owe me the money, and the other one says, I'm not sure. So therefore, the certain one will be prevailing. But why? Why do they say it's exempt? That you need to have witnesses. You need to, because unless you have witnesses, we're going to keep the money on the presumptive status of what it is. So let's try and bring a proof from our Mishnah, because our Mishnah said if he says, I don't know if you lent me the money in the first place, he's exempt. So isn't that a case of Shema? What's the case here? If you want to say, well, the first guy never made a claim against him, well, in the first place, if the first guy didn't make a claim, then why is he responsible? It must be the Kotavaway, that the first guy makes a claim, he's Bari. And the second case, and the guy says, Vikotani Seifa Pater Milashalim, and we still say it's exempt, even though he says, I don't know if I did all these things, he's Shema. So we see Bari V'Shema is Pater. So isn't this a contradiction against Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda? So the Gemara says, well, Olam the local Tavilei. No, we're talking about he hasn't made the claim against him. Viresha, and in the first case, why is he going to be responsible? He's not technically responsible, but we're talking about when he just wants to basically fill his spiritual responsibilities to heaven. So he wants to go beyond the letter of the law. And so therefore he's saying under these circumstances, he's saying that his friend says really has no evidence, but still he wants to go beyond this letter of the law, and so therefore he's going to make himself pay. In Manami, we learned Tamar B'chia Bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan Omer Chaver Manoli Biyadcha Va'ola Omer Ini Odea Chayev B'Bolat Yedei Shemayim. And we learned another price. One says you owe me money, one says I don't know, and it says you're responsible, and that's because he wants to fulfill the words of heaven. I go and tell him in Eder. So now next Mishnah, somebody steals a lamb from a flock, zero, and he returns the lamb to the flock. Umeis onigna, but then the lamb that he took died or was stolen. Chayev b'achri, so the thief is still responsible. So let's say the owner didn't even know it was taken and didn't know it was returned. And he counted the sheep, and he saw that all the flock was whole, that he wasn't missing anything. Then the guy who stole it and returned it is going to be exempt. And so the Gemara is going to have 4 different Amoraim giving 4 different positions about this. So Amarav Wadas Sarach Das, that if the Nigzal knew it was stolen, then you need to tell the Nigzal that you returned it. Shalo Das, if he had no knowledge that it was stolen, then Minyan, then if he counts it up, Poter, then the thief is going to be exempt. V'chikatani umanu etzatzon, and it says when he counts the sheep, v'hi shalema, and it was complete, as seifa. That goes to the concluding clause, where he didn't know it was stolen. But if he knew it was stolen, you need to tell him. Shmuel says, bein ladas, bein shelo ladas. Shmuel says whether he knew it was stolen or whether he didn't know, minyan poter. If he counts it up, he's exempt. V'chikatani umanu v'hi shlema. And when it says when he counts it up and he sees it's complete, poter, that the robber doesn't have to pay anymore, that's al kula. That refers to both cases, whether he knows or he doesn't know. Third case is Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says ladas. If he knew it was stolen, then minyan poter. Then he has to count it in order to be exempt. Shelo ladas. If he didn't know it was stolen, afilu minyan nami lotzarach. If he didn't know it was stolen, then he doesn't even need to count it because he didn't know it was stolen in the first place. V'chikatani umanu esatzon v'shlema hareisha. So Rabbi Yochanan says that if he knew it was stolen, then if he counts it, it was exempt. But if he didn't know it was stolen, he doesn't even need minyan. So when it says he counts it, it's complete. That refers to the first case where he knew it was stolen. Comes along Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says, "Ladas, if he knew it was stolen, then minyan poter. Then he needs to count it in order to be exempt. Shelo ladas, but if he didn't know it was stolen in the first place, then counting enough is not sufficient. Sarach das, a radical position, which how we paskin says that if he didn't know it was stolen, you need to tell him it was stolen. It's not enough just to return it. So the Gemara says, "V'chikatanu manu etzatzon," and it says when he counts the sheep and it was complete, that's referring to a case areisha where he knew it was stolen. So then Rava says, "Amar Rava, my time." Or maybe this is Rabba, let's see. Let me say Rabba. Okay, my time on top of 118b. I'm a Rabba, my time at the Rav Chisda. Hoel the Ankata Negari Baraisa. The reason why if he didn't know it was stolen, you need to tell him, is because the sheep became accustomed to go outside. And so therefore, now that it went outside, it tasted the whiff of fresh air, then it's used to going outside. And so therefore, you need to tell it or else it'll go outside again. So by the way, I thought that there was a beautiful musar in this lesson, that you could be fine in life, but once you taste something which you're maybe not supposed to taste, then it's a greater danger to all of us. Then you are used to it. And so there we have to guard ourselves against sin. So Gemara says, does Rava really say this position that the law is like Rav Chisda? Because why do we assume that the law is like Rav Chisda according to Rava? Because he's explaining his reasoning. Then does Rava really say this? Didn't Rava teach us? The Chazio Chavre. The Agba Imra me Idra Didei, Virama Bekoa, Vishaja. He saw a guy and he was lifting up a lamb from the flock of somebody else, and then Virama Bekoa. And so somebody sees that a guy is lifting up a sheep from his flock, and he raised his voice, Vishaja, and the guy threw it down, Velo Yada, and he doesn't know Ihadre or Lo Hadre. He didn't know, he wasn't sure if he had returned it or not. Umeis, and then the sheep died, Onignav, or was stolen, Chayev Bachriuso. Then we're going to say that the robber is responsible. Don't we say, aren't we talking about a case, Mylav, Afagav, to money, even in the case where he counted the sheep and he said it was complete, and therefore, why is he responsible? It proves that Rav is of the position that if you steal with knowledge, it's not enough to do the counting. Not like Rav Chisda says that if you steal it with knowledge, you just have to count. So isn't this a contradiction against Rav Chisda? Gemara says, no. The little money. In that case, he didn't count it, and that's why he's responsible. And does Rav really say this position that if you steal without his knowledge, you need to tell him that it was returned, or he needs to count it, and that's sufficient? That's what Rav said. He says, "Tzarach ladas, tzarach das, shlo ladas, minyan pater." If you steal with his knowledge, he needs knowledge. If you steal without his knowledge, he needs to count it. Is that really what Rav says? If you were just returned into the wilderness, you fulfilled your obligation. Amarafuna bar Abba Modarav Barakuasa. No, that's talking about a unusually colored sheep where he's going to be clearly notice its back. Let's just say that this four-way machokas amongst the Amoraim is actually reflective of an earlier dispute amongst the Tanaim, because they have a brayso that says, "Agonav talam in either if you steal a lamb from the flock, v'selam in a kiss, or if you steal a coin from the wallet, l'makom sheganav yachzir, to the place that it was stolen, you have to return it." Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva says, "Tzarach das ba'alim." Rabbi Akiva says, you need to alert the person that you return it. So Rabbi Shmuel says you just need to drop it back off. Rabbi Akiva says you need to alert the person. So the Gemara's assumption is the Kuli Alma Islu de Rabbi Yitzchak, that everybody takes as a prerequisite and is in agreement with the position of Rabbi Yitzchak, who says, Adam Asar Lamashmesh Bekisa V'Kol. A person's always going to be playing with the money in his wallet. And meaning to say that he always knows what's there, he's always feeling it. And so my lav besel adas. So aren't we talking about a case where he knows it was stolen? Ubepukta de Rav Ushmuel. So ubepukta de Rav Ushmuel. And is the argument that same argument as between Rav and Shmuel, meaning to say that Rabbi Yishmael says that he just needs to return, he doesn't need to tell anything. He holds like Shmuel, who says whether or not is with das or without das, as long as you count it, the thief is exempt as long as the original owner counted it. Here too, he must have counted it because it was returned. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says you need the knowledge of the owner, he holds like Rav, who says that when you steal it, and the person knows it's stolen, that you need to tell him that you returned it, and just counting it is not sufficient. Gemara says no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a case where it was stolen without the owner's knowledge, meaning say he had no idea it was stolen. And this is the dispute between Rav Chisda and Rabbi Yochanan. Meaning to say, Rabbi Shmuel says that the place that it was stolen, you could return it. You don't need the ownership, him to know. He holds like Rabbi Yochanan. He says that if the guy didn't know it was stolen, you don't even need to count it. Whereas according to Rabbi Akiva, he holds like Rav Chisda says that he's required to tell the owner it was stolen. Amar Rav Zvid Mishmei de Rava, Begonim Rishus Baalim Kuyamu Lepligi. So Rav Zvid says in the name of Rava that if you steal it from the domain of the owner, everybody would agree, Kid Rav Chisda, that you have to tell him it was stolen. So here, what we're talking about is where there was a watchman who stole it from his own domain. That's what we're talking about. Whether he can just return it. Rabbi Akiva Savar, he can't just return it. Because the Shmira ended, so he needs to alert them. Rabbi Shmuel Savar will call Solosh Shmira. His Shmira is watching, hasn't ended, so he could just return it. Minyan Poter, let's say that this dispute of whether or not you counted it exempts you, exempts the robber, is actually a machokas tanaim. The Tanya gozo es chaver. Let's say somebody steals money from his friend, and when he pays it back, he's embarrassed to tell him he stole. So even though he owed him 90, he paid him 100, and he covered up for the $10 he stole. So Tanya chada yatsa, Tanya idachol yatsa. One position says you fulfill your obligation because you paid him back everything. The other position is you didn't. So the assumption is that everybody agrees with Rabbi Yitzchak, who says that a person always knows what's in his pocket. He always is touching his money. So what are they arguing about? The one who says he fulfilled his obligation says once you count it, he's exempt, and for sure he counts it because it's in his wallet. So the one who says he didn't fulfill his obligation, Savar Minyan Eno Pater. He says no, when he counts it, he's not exempt. You need to tell him, like Rav Chisda. The Gemara says no. If you would hold like Rav Yitzchak, the Gemara says, if you would really hold like Rabbi Yitzchak, if you hold like Rabbi Yitzchak, everybody would say you counted it, and he's exempt. Ella, but the Rabbi Yitzchak, they're arguing about Rabbi Yitzchak. Mar Islay to Rabbi Yitzchak, Mar Islay to Rabbi Yitzchak. The only question is whether or not we could assume he counted it. We buy the same as the Kuli Alma Islu could Rabbi Yitzchak. Everybody could assume. We could always assume he counts it. Volkasha ha de money urame bekise ha de money urame yade. One is where the robber picked up the money, and he put it in the wallet. And so since the person's always touching his wallet, for sure he knows it's back. And one is where he put it into the hands of the person who was robbed. And it's possible that he immediately threw it into the box where he keeps the money, and so therefore he never counted it. Or both cases he put it in his wallet. And it depends whether or not he has other money in the wallet to confuse him. So now we're up to the next Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Ein lochen min haroim semer v'cholav ugedim. You're not allowed to buy from shepherds wool and milk and goats, kid goats. Because the assumption is that they're there to watch it, not to sell it, so they probably stole it. So you can't buy from people who you think it was stolen. We won't be shomer peros, and not also from people who are in charge of watching fruit or eitzim. From people who are in charge of watching fruit, you can't buy eitzim with peros. You can't buy wood and fruit. You can buy from women. We assume that those women, they are basically, the practice was that they used to sell the wool in Judah and the flax in Galilee. Or you can buy calves in the Sharon. The Kulan Sha'amro Vahatmin Aser. And all of them, where they said to, where when they sell it to you, they say, you know what, just hide it. Don't let anybody see that you're getting this. That's prohibited because that's clearly like they don't want the police to know, or they don't want anybody to know. It seems like it's a hot item that's stolen. And you could always buy chickens or eggs because the assumption is that a person usually wouldn't steal because the markup is so low. You're not allowed to, so it says you're not allowed to buy from the shepherds, and that you can't buy goats or baby goats or shearings or pieces of the wool of a lochin mehen, but you could purchase from the shepherds to furin. You could, if it was sewn together. Why? Because even if they stole it, they would have acquired it through the sewing up of it, and so therefore it's okay. Because then you're buying a different item than what they stole. And you're allowed to buy the milk or the cheese in the wilderness because the person who gives the shepherds his animals isn't going to expect to transport the milk and the cheese from the desert. Obviously, it's going to spoil. But will be yishuv, but not in the city, because in the city the guy wants his milk and cheese. The will command dalad v'heitzon and dalad v'hegizin, and you could buy 4 or 5 sheep or 4 or 5 shearings, because then the guy would notice they're missing. Avalo shteitzon, v'lo shteigizin, but not 2 sheep or 2 shearings, because then he wouldn't know it was missing. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda's other position, Bayasos lochem mehen. Midbarios and lochamen. If these are sheep that go to the house, then you could buy from them, because then the assumption is the owner would know that they were missing. But if they're wilderness sheep, you can't. Kol shal davar. The basic rule is kol sha'aroa mocher balabayis margish. The basic rule is whatever the shepherd would sell, and the owner of the flock would notice, then lochamen. Then you could purchase. But a margish bo. But if he wouldn't notice, ein lochamen, you can't purchase. Amar Mar Lochem Mehen Dalad Veheitzon Dalad Vehegizin. You can purchase from them 4 or 5 sheep or 4 or 5 shearings. So the Gemara asks the question: Hashi Yishlomer Arba Zavnina Chamisha Mibai. Well, if we already said you could buy 4, for sure you could buy 5. So Amar Avchista Arba Mito Chamisha. No, you could buy, if there were 5, you could buy 4 of them. Or Ika Da'amri Amar Avchista Arba Me'eder Katan Chamesh Me'eder Gadol. You could buy 4 from a small flock or 5 from a large flock, because then it'd be noticeable. Hagufa Gasha. And there's an internal contradiction. Amris dalad veitzon, dalad vehegizin. You could buy 4 or 5 sheep or 4 or 5 shearings, which implies dalad vehein. Aval shlo. You could buy 4 or 5, but you can't buy 3. You can't buy 3. Ema seifa, but the next clause says avalo shteitzon. You can't buy 2 sheep. Hashalosh zavninon, which means you could buy 3. So which is it? So the Gemara says lokasha haba briyasa haba shusa. Depends if the sheep are healthy or if they're weak. If they're weak, you could buy 3, wouldn't notice. And so he won't keep a track on them. And so therefore you can't buy 3 because he doesn't notice. But if they're healthy, you could buy 3 because you would know it was missing. It says the Mishnah said, Rabbi Yehuda says, by Tasos Lokos, man, you could buy the wilderness, the ones in the houses, but not the ones in the desert, in the wilderness, because he wouldn't know it's missing. When Rabbi Yehuda says this, in the Braisa, Areisha Kai Ulachomra, does he mean to be strict? When it says that Odama Seifa Kai Ulakua, or is he saying on the latter clause and he's being lenient? Areisha Kai Ulachomra, is he talking about the former clause, the first clause, and he's being strict? Damar Ulachomra, Damar Lochaman Arba V'Chamisha. The Braisa says you could buy 4 or 5 stone, and Ani Milo by Tosos. When can you buy 4 or 5 if they're sheep that go home? But in the wilderness, you can't buy 4 or 5 even in the wilderness. Or maybe it refers to the last clause, and he's being lenient. It says you can't buy 2 sheep or 2 shearings. That's in the wilderness. But if there's sheep that go home every night, you can buy 2 because the guy will know. Tashma. So let's bring a proof. Tanya Rabbi Omer. Lochem by Tasos mehan ve'in lochem midbarios. You can buy the sheep that go home, but not the wilderness sheep. Ubekol makom lochem mehan arba v'chamisha tzon. Wherever you are, you can buy 4 or 5 sheep. Midamar bekol makom. So we see when he uses the language of wherever you are, shmami na seifakai. We see he's referring to the latter clause ulakua, and he's being lenient that you could always buy 4 or 5 sheep, but in the homes you could even buy 2. Okay, so we'll stop here, and we're up to the last stop of Maseches Bava Kamma. If anybody has any questions.